The 750 nationals with criminal past that the federal government is unable to deport from Quebec are just the tip of the iceberg, Mr. Speaker. In 2020, the Auditor General denounced the CBSA's failure to investigate the whereabouts of people who are supposed to be deported. I quote Ms. Hogan, "At least 70% of cases involving criminals had not been reviewed annually, and 75% of cases involving failed asylum seekers had not been reviewed every 3 years as they should have been." Mr. Speaker, clearly the agency is unable to act. Is it because of a lack of resources or a lack of political will? The Honourable Minister for Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, it will come to no one's surprise. It's not one or the other. It's a circumstance that many other countries have seen in the world with an increase of asylum seekers. However, we do accept the responsibility under our statutes. We must make sure that certain people who are a threat for Canada's public safety, make sure that they are detained before they are sent out of Canada. And that is exactly the kind of investments that we're doing now, and we'll continue to guarantee the safety of everyone.
Minister will have her getting the bill no more treatment. And Canadians have to foot the bill for the spending spree separation. We know she already blew through her $40 billion fiscal guardrail promise. But what is the deficit number?
Yeah.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I do really look forward to tabling the fall economic statement in this House on Monday. And in the fall economic statement on Monday, we will show that the government is maintaining its fiscal anchor, specifically reducing the federal debt as a share of the economy over the medium term. In addition, I expect the debt to GDP ratio we projected in the spring budget for fiscal year 23-24 will be met. Canada has the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. We have the lowest deficit, and this is good news for Canada and Canadians.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. After 9 years of this Prime Minister, supported by the Bloc, the Liberal government is in full meltdown. The Prime Minister and his Finance Minister are at loggerheads and both have lost control of the country's public finances. The Finance Minister has made a promise. The Liberal government's deficit will not exceed $40 billion. The Prime Minister couldn't care less about the consequences for Canadian families. A simple question. While he's still here, what is the deficit? Who won? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Finance. Mr. Speaker, Canadians will win. Why? Because our government is united. Our government is working all together to deliver the goods for Canadians. With dental care, with early childcare, with medicine for Canadians. We are here for Canadians, and we are proud to be here for them, and we do it as a team.
The Honourable Member. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister doesn't even seem to want to listen to what the Minister of Finance has to say. There's infighting on the other side of the House. The Globe and Mail has said that 5 Liberal Party veterans and 3 political staffers have confirmed that tensions are growing between the Minister of Finance's office and the PMO. We know that the Minister of Finance really wants to keep things at her already high level of $40 billion for the deficit, but the Prime Minister wants it to go to an even more shocking level. Will the Minister of Finance keep her word and state that finally she is sticking to the $40 billion deficit? What is the deficit? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, I will be tabling the fall economic statement on Monday in this very House. And in the fall economic statement next week, we will show that this government is maintaining its budget anchors. It's all about reducing the proportion of the federal debt in the economy over the medium term. And the debt to GDP ratio that we stated in the spring budget will be respected. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Canadians are hurting, and we saw it expressed in the gallery today. Renters in Canada are facing exploitation and eviction because of corporate greed.
Shame on the Conservative. Colleagues, I'm having difficulty hearing the question. It is not for the chair to agree or disagree with the content of the question, but to making sure that it does follow the rules. I'm asking members to please restrain themselves. The Honourable Member from Port Moody Coquitlam from the top, please.
Canadians are hurting, and we saw it expressed in the gallery today. Renters in Canada are facing exploitation and eviction because of corporate greed.
I'm going to invite the honourable member to rephrase her question. I just want to remind the member that we should not make reference to what has or has not happened in the galleries today to ensure that Canadians, to ensure that this behaviour is not repeated. The honourable member from Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Canadians are hurting, and we saw it expressed in the gallery today.
Again. Order. And I hope the honourable member can understand and can hear my voice when I do say that we should not make reference to what has happened in the gallery or not happened in the gallery. And I'll invite the honourable member to rephrase her question for the last time before I move on.
Canadians are hurting, and we saw in Ottawa today that it was expressed around homelessness.
Yes, that's right.
Renters in Canada are facing exploitation and eviction because of corporate greed. It's so bad, a class action lawsuit has started against corporate landlords, accusing them of price fixing using the AI program YieldStar. For months, New Democrats have called on the Liberals to protect renters. But the Liberals and Conservatives chose to protect corporate profits over people. Why is the Prime Minister letting down renters and caving to corporate landlord CEOs?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, no one in this country is choosing to be homeless. No one is choosing to live in an encampment. We know that the cost of housing has gotten too high. That's why we are putting billions of dollars of investments on the table to help build out more affordable housing, to help community entities actually provide services to people who do not have a roof over their head. What's fascinating, Mr. Speaker, is that Conservatives seek to make a joke out of a very serious issue such as homelessness. We're going to be willing to do the hard work to build more homes, including the most vulnerable. And as the jeering continues, Canadians should be ashamed of the behaviour of the Conservative Party, who use homeless people as props in this country.
The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley. Colleagues, the honourable member from Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, in January, Air Canada will become the latest big airline to charge junk fees for basic services like checked baggage. And the minister's reaction to this? She's taking a page from the industry minister's playbook and going to sit down with the CEOs and ask very nicely if they would please change their ways. It didn't work for grocery prices, and it's not going to work for these airlines' junk fees. It turns out the minister has the regulatory power she needs to stand up for Canadians that are tired of being gouged. Will she use it?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board and Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member opposite actually has it inaccurate. If I could clarify, we are extremely concerned with airlines putting forward junk fees, and the Minister of Finance has specified this in successive budgets. I will be speaking with the airline executives. I will be calling them out for charging these extra fees. Canadians want excellent service, not excellent fees, and our government will be standing for passengers and Canadians every step of the way.
The honourable member for Davenport.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians received great news last week about a temporary tax break we are implementing for all Canadians. Our government is exempting essentials like groceries, snacks,
children's clothing and gifts from the GST starting December 14. This will deliver tangible and immediate support to Canadians struggling with the cost of
Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would really like to thank my neighbour, the Honourable Member for Davenport, for that great question and for her very hard work on behalf of her constituents. It's expensive to raise a family, especially around the holidays, so our government is stepping up to support Canadians by giving them a tax break. This includes children's clothing, diapers, and car seats. And with the holidays coming up, we're also making children's toys, puzzles, books, and board games tax-free. For a party that claims to want to lower taxes, the Conservatives sure seem keen on taxing Canadians' holidays. Why won't the Conservatives support them?
The honourable member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the Finance Minister said that the government would not crash through the deficit guardrail. The Globe reports today that all the Prime Minister's new spending is upending the deficit target and that finance officials view it as unwise and making little sense. Tonight, we vote on $24.8 billion in new spending. So will the Finance Minister tell us why we should vote for something that upends the deficit target, that is unwise, and that makes little sense?
Yeah, way to go.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I do look forward to tabling the fall economic statement in this House on Monday. And in next week's fall economic statement, we will show that the government is maintaining its fiscal anchor, specifically reducing the federal debt as a share of the economy over the medium term. In addition, I expect that the debt-to-GDP ratio we projected in the spring budget for fiscal year 23-24 will be met. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the Globe also reports that the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister are at odds over all this new spending. It reports that the Prime Minister's office has viewed the Finance Minister as ineffective in communicating, and also stated that a senior Liberal said that the current dynamic appears to be similar to what happened to Bill Morneau before he resigned in 2020. John Turner resigned as Finance Minister in 1975 when he was at odds with the Prime Minister. Simple question. Does the Finance Minister still have confidence in the Prime Minister?
Yeah.
The Honourable Order. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Yes.
Order. The honourable member for Peterborough-Kawartha.
According to the Globe and Mail, the Finance Minister herself said the radical Liberal spending risks blowing past her promised fiscal guardrails. So she has a choice. She can break rank and join the Liberal minister graveyard, like the former Finance Minister Bill Morneau, or she can abide by this weak Prime Minister and drive Canadians off of a fiscal cliff. Which one?
Order. The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, what we are seeing from the Conservatives is an attempt to distract from the fact that when they have an opportunity to support a tax reduction for Canadians, they actually voted against it, Mr. Speaker. They talk out of one side of their mouth and do the absolute opposite all of the time, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we are absolutely united in our support for Canadians. And over the holidays, we are proud to offer them a GST holiday to make sure that they can have toys and clothing and car seats and diapers at a reduced price for their children, and that's what matters to us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm going to ask the honourable member for Barrie Innisfil, please, to not take the floor. The honourable member for Peterborough-Kawartha.
Mr. Speaker, you can't spend your way out of debt. The fact that the Conservatives have to say that to the Finance Minister speaks volumes to why we have record high usage of food banks in this country. She has a choice today, and everyone knows there's tension. She promised a guardrail of $40 billion, which in itself is outrageous. Bill Morneau, the former Finance Minister, was in the same position, and he wouldn't abide by that weak Prime Minister, and he quit. The question is, will she have the courage to do the same and stand up for Canadians, not that Prime
Minister? The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the only people who are engaging in bullying tactics in the House are the members of the Conservative Party of Canada. Mr. Speaker, if they truly cared about supporting Canadians through these tough times, they would have voted in favour of the GST tax break over the holidays. But this is par for the course with those members opposite. They cry crocodile tears, but whenever it comes to helping Canadians, they oppose them. Whether it's the school food program that is already going to be supporting 200,000 kids across this country, the Canada Child Benefit that puts up to over $7,000 a year in the pockets of Canadian families, they oppose it. Mr. Speaker, we are united in our support for Canadians, and we will continue to stand up against those.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Mr. Speaker, we've had the Arrive Can fiasco, but now we have the fiasco at the CBSA. This was a customs clearance application, and it broke down 22 times in the first 30 days of its use. It completely paralyzed imports and was a total failure, despite the fact that it cost 50% more than planned. With inconclusive tests and hidden documentation, the Trade Committee has unanimously, including the Liberals on the committee, asked the AG to look into this. Will the Minister listen to his own colleagues and agree to the AG investigation? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, I don't want to correct my colleague, but when he says that the committee adopted a motion unanimously, we would have thought that would include our Liberal colleagues, which confirms the fact that we want parliamentary committees to stand up and respect the independence of the Auditor General as well. If she decides to look into this, of course the government will be happy to look into it. We expect the AG to do excellent work, as she always does. The Honourable Member. Well, yesterday when the Minister answered, he praised our border agents for their hard work, and we also agree that they should be praised for that, but we're not so sure about their bosses and their offices. The CBSA was already under the spotlight with ArriveCan, but today the problem is the CARM application, with all of its various budget and functioning problems. Because ArriveCan at least worked, CARM doesn't even work, and if it takes Ottawa as long to fix this as it took to fix the Phoenix pay system, our businesses will have hell to pay. Will the Minister do something about this?
L'honorable ministre de Sécurité publique.
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, we are always looking for solutions. As my colleague very well knows, this system replaced an outdated 36-year-old system, which might have broken down at any moment on a broad scale. It is used to evaluate $40 billion in taxes and tariffs every year. This government is always looking to secure a system that is so important for the Canadian economy. We quickly deal with all problems in order to give importers quick answers, and we will continue to do so.
The Honourable Member for Lambton Kent Middlesex.
Speaker, the NDP Liberal government recklessly pushed through their costly temporary GST tax trick that's going to hurt our small businesses, and they're trying to buy votes with a $250 check. But the finance minister's own department called this over $6 billion spend, quote, fiscally unwise, and described it as making no fiscal economic sense. Because of spending like this, we know that the finance minister is going to blow through her $40.1 billion fiscal guardrail. So will she confirm that her deficit won't be a penny over $46 billion?
The Honourable Minister for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises.
Mr. Speaker, this is coming from a member whose leader calls our government supports big fat government spending. When it's time to step up, the Conservative Party never steps up to support small businesses. We have cut taxes for small businesses from 11% to 9%, saving small businesses $6.3 billion every single year. We are putting more money back into the pockets of small businesses through our Canada Carbon Rebate. That's $2.5 billion going out to 600,000 small businesses across the country. We will always be there to support them, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Lambton Kent Middlesex.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you know Canada is about to be sent over a fiscal cliff when the Liberals can't even do basic math. Mr. Speaker, that's why tensions are rising in the Liberal caucus. The finance minister is as unfit to lead as her boss. Maybe that's why the Prime Minister is making unilateral financial decisions. So will the finance minister continue to go blindly and continue to put Canada decimate our economy, or will she actually show some leadership and stick to her $40 billion fiscal guardrail?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, on this side of the House, we are putting Canadians first. That's right. That is what we have done for the last 9 years. In understanding when times are tough, we are there for Canadians. Mr. Speaker, what we hear from Conservative members of Parliament is that when times are tough, they look to take supports away from Canadians, not to be there for them. We will not allow that to happen, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to be there for Canadians every step of the way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, according to the Globe and Mail, there is more and more tension between the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance about ideas like this electioneering vote-buying effort to reduce or to remove the GST over the holidays. And even federal public servants or their own staffers are saying that this $6 billion cost is fiscally imprudent. We know that the Prime Minister has completely lost control over the finances. Does the minister understand that she needs to say stop to this Prime Minister's crazed requests? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Well, as we've heard from the Minister of Finance on several occasions, this is a matter of fiscal accountability. Because here in Canada, we have the best fiscal record of any country in the G7, including the debt to GDP ratio, the deficit to GDP ratio, as well as debt interest costs. Interest rates are going down. Inflation is going down. Employment is going up. What's really irresponsible is to do as the Conservatives are doing. They keep repeating that it's hard for Canadians to get by right now, but they're actually trying to make their lives even harder.
The Honourable Member for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government made a great announcement to support Canadians over this holiday season because the holiday should be a stress-free period for Canadians. However,
we're going to ask the Honourable Member to start again. Order! Order! But this is a good time to remind all members to be very careful about objects that they put on their microphones, as it hurts the ears, which are the tools of our interpreters. The Honourable Member from Fleetwood Port Kells from the top.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This isn't standing right there, you know. Anyway, government did make that great announcement to support Canadians over the holiday season. Holidays should be a stress-free period for all Canadians, but for some, this isn't the case, as spending can be a source of difficulty for some families. So we have a plan for that, but that would be the plan that the Conservatives voted against. Could the Minister share more details about our government's plan to put more money in the pockets of Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for his question and also for the hard work that he does on behalf of his constituents and Canadians. We will always be there for Canadians, Mr. Speaker, for families and businesses in good times and in the hard times. Twice we've offered tax cuts to the middle class, and twice the Conservative leader has voted against them. Today, with the GST cut, we're providing even greater support for families and businesses. You'd think with all the slogans and the childish shouting, this would be a no-brainer for the Conservatives, but they voted against this tax cut. They vote against Canadians. We are here for them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from South Shore St. Margaret's.
The Globe and Mail is reporting a big fight between the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance. They have blown through every deficit target every year, but apparently we ain't seen nothing yet. Just like what happened to the last Finance Minister, the Prime Minister does not care about this Finance Minister breaking her promise that the deficit would not be more than $40 billion. But hey, who cares when the Prime Minister fears for his political life? Simple question. Is the deficit more than $40 billion? Yes or no?
Good question.
Order. The honourable member, the honourable minister, and leader of the government in the House of Commons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, what we see from Conservative members of Parliament is their attempt to distract from the fact that when given the opportunity to vote for a tax break for Canadians, they voted against it. They're traveling across the country saying that they're going to cut taxes, but at the very first opportunity to do that, they say no. And Mr. Speaker, this is actually a pattern of behavior because over the past 9 years, when we have brought forward other tax cuts for the middle class or benefits for Canadians, what do, Mr. Speaker? They vote against them. On this side of the House, we're going to stay focused on Canadians and delivering for them in their time of need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from South Shore St. Margaret's.
Well, there you have it, a real-life Thelma and Louise. The Prime Minister driving Canadians through the Finance Minister's deficit guardrail into the abyss. The Prime Minister is throwing the Finance Minister under the bus. And now, in the Globe and Mail, senior Liberals are throwing the Prime Minister's vote buying under the bus. It truly is hard to imagine a deficit number so bad that even senior Liberals are complaining. So what's the deficit number that is so large that even leaking Liberals are appalled?
The honourable order. The honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Mr. Speaker, I've been listening patiently during this entire question period, and I've heard a lot of attacks of the Minister of Finance. I'll tell you why we support that incredible female leader. Because what does she do? She empowers women around this country. How does she do that? She puts in place programs like a Canada Child Care program.
The Speaker stood up because the honourable member from Peterborough Kawartha was... I'm going to ask the honourable member from Peterborough Kawartha, please, to withhold herself while we listen to the honourable minister. The honourable minister... The honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General, start from the top.
Mr. Speaker, I've been listening patiently for all of question period about attacks of the current finance minister. I'm going to tell you what a strong female leader looks like. A strong female finance minister empowers women to participate in our economy. How do you do that? You put in place and have the courage to put in place something like a Canada Child Care program that has resulted in 85% women's labour force participation rate in this country. That is an all-time high. That is what a feminist looks like. That is what a great woman leader looks like. That is what a great finance minister looks like. And that's somebody who will stand behind every single day in this chamber.
Order. The honourable member for Charleswood St. James, Assiniboia Headingley.
The Globe and Mail has reported that tensions are on the rise, that this weak Prime Minister is forcing the Minister of Finance to spend even more. The Minister promised Canadians, out of her own mouth, the deficit would not exceed $40 billion. Now it's clear she's crashed right through that guardrail. Canadians deserve to know how much the deficit is. Don't make them wait until Monday. Tell us the number now.
Yeah, way to go!
Once again, I'll just remind all members to point the question through the chair. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that member knows very well that we are bringing forward the fall economic statement next Monday, and we are very much looking forward to the Finance Minister presenting that to this House. And we are exceptionally proud of the record of this government, of which the Finance Minister has been an incredible leader in, Mr. Speaker, whether it comes to the Canada Child Benefit, childcare for Canadians, a national school food program, supporting Canadians and businesses through the worst pandemic in our lives, Mr. Speaker. She was at the helm of that, led us through those difficult times, and we know that together we will continue to support Canadians and lead them through these tough times.
The Honourable Member for the Northwest Territories.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Minister of Foreign Affairs announced a new Arctic foreign policy. It reflects the reality of our region and was developed in partnership with Indigenous governments as well as Arctic and territorial partners. It strengthens our work here at home and our engagement with other nations, northern nations like Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and the United States. They are Canada's like-minded Arctic partners and are all apparently countries that Conservatives have never heard of. For Northerners and Indigenous people who call the Arctic home to all Canadians, can the Minister tell us why she launched the foreign...
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Allow me to thank the MP for the Northwest Territory. As the world is getting tougher, we need to get tougher. Yes, this Arctic foreign policy builds on the biggest investments in our defense in generations, more than the Conservative ever did. It puts people in the North first, allowing Indigenous peoples, particularly Inuit and Northerners, to be at the center of international relations affecting them. Russia and China are working together against our interest in the Arctic. This is something that we take seriously, contrary to the Leader of the Opposition that is not serious about defending our North and trivializing Northerners.
The Honourable Member for Foothills, please. I'm going to ask members to not have a conversation unless they want to take it behind the table. The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Kidd Mine in Timmins has been an economic driver in the North for the last 60 years, but the end is near, and we need to prepare for what comes next. Northern Ontario is no stranger to heartbreak, mine and mill closures, but it doesn't have to be this way in Timmins. We have a huge opportunity to shift investment to the Timmins Nickel Project. That's a project that ticks all the boxes: critical minerals, job creation, and supportive infrastructure. So to the Minister, will he commit to work with the city now to ensure that there are no delays in transitioning Timmins to a stronger and more sustainable future?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources and Energy.
I want to thank my honourable colleague for the question. Certainly, critical minerals, including very much the Crawford Mine, offer enormous opportunities across this country. That is certainly true in Northern Ontario. The Crawford Mine is something that is a very important project moving forward. We just announced an investment of the Critical Minerals Infrastructure Fund in the Crawford Mine, and I'm certainly very happy to sit down with the folks in Timmins to have that conversation.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, late Friday, we learned that the Vista Thermal Coal Mine expansion in the Rocky Mountains is going ahead without an impact assessment. This despite the fact that the former minister promised me twice over the past 4 years that they would do that. Albertans don't want coal mining in the Rocky Mountains. This government pretends to care about our environment, even while making false promises to stop mining thermal coal and stop polluters in our beloved Rocky Mountains. When will the minister protect our Rocky Mountains instead of protecting the profits of billionaires?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for her question. As she is well aware, the Supreme Court last year directed the government to review some of the elements under the Impact Assessment Act of Canada, which is what we've done. We still have a commitment to phase out coal thermal export by 2030, Mr. Speaker, and she also knows that 10 Indigenous...
And I ask the Honourable Member who just asked a question to please, who had an opportunity to ask a question, to please extend that same opportunity for the person to answer it. The Honourable Minister can take it from the top.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my colleague is well aware, the Supreme Court of Canada directed the government to make some changes to the Impact Assessment Act of Canada last year, which is what we've done. We still have a commitment to ban the export of thermal coal by 2030, Mr. Speaker. And she also knows that 10 Indigenous communities are supporting this project, which is why, in the end, the Impact Assessment Act, the Assessment Agency of Canada, decided that an evaluation was not necessary. Thank you.
Good job.
Colleagues, during a statement from members, the Honourable Member from Vancouver Kingsway was making a statement from which a member had unwittingly walked in front of the camera. As it is normal on our tradition, we allow the Honourable Member to make a statement again. The Honourable Member from Vancouver Kingsway.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to honour one of Canada's finest public servants, our Ambassador to Germany and former Premier of British Columbia, the late John Horgan. Raised by a single mom, John overcame great challenges to rise to the highest levels of public office. His political career actually started in this place, staffing NDP MPs. In 1991, he left to assume important roles in the BC NDP government, ending as Chief of Staff to the Premier. John entered elected office as an MLA in 2005 and ultimately became leader of the party, the official opposition, and a very popular Premier.
Throughout, John carved a deeply impactful path. He had an uncommon touch. He had that rare ability to rise above partisanship and win the respect of his opponents. He was witty, kind, and positive. In my view, John was the best off-the-cuff speaker in Canadian politics. We extend our deepest condolences to John's beloved Ellie and their 2 sons. John, thank you. Your kind shall not pass this way again.
I understand there are a couple of points of order. The Honourable Member from Nanaimo Ladysmith is rising on her feet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe if you seek it, you will find unanimous consent for the following motion. That the House recognize that today, on the International Day for Human Rights, the Nobel Committee has awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for 2024 to Nihon Hindankyo, the Japanese grassroots organization of atomic bomb survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, also known as Hibakusha. Acknowledge that Hibakusha has worked tirelessly for decades to raise awareness of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapon use. C. Recognize the ongoing relevance of their message in a world where the threat of nuclear weapons remains a pressing concern. D. Affirm that nuclear disarmament is a crucial step towards ensuring global peace and security. And E, Mr. Speaker, encourage the government to take concrete steps to honor this award, including enhanced engagement with the TPNW, participation in international disarmament efforts, and collaboration with civil society to advance the cause of nuclear abolition. Thank you.
All those opposed to the Honourable Member moving the motion will please say nay. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Carried. I see that the Honourable Member from Regina Capella is also rising on a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. During question period, there was a disturbance in the gallery, and it was very alarming to see the NDP member for Port Moody Coquitlam almost immediately not just reference it, but it seemed to have been incorporated into her question. It was a prepared question. You could tell it was prepared because even after you admonished her for pointing out the disturbance in the gallery, she could not adapt and repeated it 3 times. Now, it seems like this was a coordinated event, that someone was invited into the chamber and the member knew that there would be such a disturbance. So I'd ask that you look into the matter, Mr. Speaker, and report back to the House as to how this individual gained entry into the gallery, on whose behalf was this person invited. This comes on the heels of a security scare today in the Wellington building and a protest in the Confederation building last week where members of Parliament were impeded access to their offices, threatened, and forced to face toxic behavior. This is a pattern of behavior we're seeing from the NDP. As we come to the end of this session, Mr. Speaker, it's incumbent upon all members to respect the security and safety of this place.
Yeah.
Great.
I see that the honourable member from New Westminster Burnaby is also rising on the same point of order. The honourable member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's not surprising to me with the Conservatives who allowed for 3 weeks the occupation of downtown Ottawa, including impeding MPs coming to the West Block consistently, that they would raise this. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, the member from Port Moody Coquitlam properly corrected her question. I would suggest for Conservatives who are repetitive not only with one member, but their entire question period lineup often violates these standing orders and are very repetitive, that they should actually walk the talk and they should try to offer something more to Canadians during question period.
I see that the honourable member for Port Moody Coquitlam is rising on the same point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And since the member from Regina Capel has decided to be a mind reader, I just wanted to clarify that although the Conservatives are used to being told what to do, I am not. And Mr. Speaker, if you would so kindly check the notes that I gave to the pages here, you will see that I have handwritten notes about the very, very important interventions in Ottawa today from people around homelessness in this country and how desperate folks are. So I would just raise that, Mr. Speaker, that I do have a mind of my own, unlike the Conservatives.
Exactly.
I thank honourable members for their interventions, and the chair will come back to this matter if necessary. It being 3:33, the House will now proceed to the taking of deferred recorded division on the motion of Ms. Landsman relating to the business of supply. Call on the members. The question is as follows. La question est la suivante. Madame Landsman, appuyée par...
Ms Landsman, seconded by Mr Hallan, moved that given that after 9 years of this Liberal Prime Minister, monthly rent and mortgages payments have doubled. May I dispense? The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started. I didn't hear anyone asking that it not be dispensed. Back to 1, monthly rent and mortgages payments have doubled. 2, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, finds that Canada has the most unaffordable housing market in the G7 and the second most unaffordable in the entire OECD. 3, Habitat for Humanity finds that almost 1/3 of Canadian millennials would consider relocating to another country to find affordable housing.
4, the PBO says that chronic homelessness is up by 38% across Canada since 2018, despite Liberal promises to eliminate it by 2030. In order to save Canadian homebuyers up to $50,000 or $2,500 per year in mortgage payments, the House called on the Liberal government to immediately eliminate the federal sales tax on new homes sold under $1 million and called on the provincial premiers to match this proposal. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person.
All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Ms. Dancho.
Ms. Dancho.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Commit.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Currick.
Mr. Kirk.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Duncan Stormadunda South Glengarry.
Mr. Duncan Stormadunda South Glengarry.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abu Tayyip.
Mr. Abu Tayyip.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Straw.
Monsieur Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Morant.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Culkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Généreux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Major.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur
Correction.
Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolney.
Mr. Tolney.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mrs. Falk.
Battleford.
Battleford Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk Battleford Lloydminster.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Monsieur d'Entremont.
Mr. D'Entremont.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Stewart Toronto St. Paul.
Mr. Stewart Toronto St. Paul.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Ms. Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
Ms. McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Ms. Idlout.
Miss Idlout.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Ms. Dance.
Miss Dance.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Ms. Blaney.
Ms. Blaney.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Barron.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Que tous ceux qui s'opposent à la motion.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Ms. Ng.
Ms. Ng.
Mr. Guilbeault.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Ms. Hutchings.
Ms. Hutchings.
Ms. Tassie.
Ms. Tassie.
Ms. Suds.
Ms. Suds.
Ms. Chagger.
Ms. Chagger.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Scrow.
Ms. Scrow.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Ms. Kara.
Ms. Kara.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Ms. Jazek.
Ms. Jazik.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Fagascatos.
Mr. Fagascatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Ms. de Brewston.
Mr. Brewston.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Ms. Zarowitz.
Ms. Zarowitz.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Monsieur Yakano.
Monsieur Yakano.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Dogood.
Mr. Dogood.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Serré.
Monsieur Serré.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Ms. Sidhu Brampton South.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Mr. Nur Mohammed.
Mr. Nur Mohammed.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Ali.
Mr. Ali.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Hanley.
Mr. Hanley.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Meow.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Michaud.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Thériault.
Madame Gaudreau.
Madame Gaudreau.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Barcelou-Duval.
Monsieur Duval.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés.
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
La Chambre attendra maintenant.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Je désire informer la Chambre que
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
le Bureau va maintenant compiler
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 146, 146. Nays contre 186, 186.
Je déclare la motion
I declare the motion rejected.
La Chambre procédera maintenant au vote.
The House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the previous question to the motion to concur in the 8th report of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. The question is on the previous question. Mr. Lamoureux, seconded by Mr. Chiang, moved that this question be now put. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Ms. Suds.
Ms. Suds.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Scrow.
Ms. Scrow.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Ms. Jazek.
Ms. Jazek.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Mrs. Romanato.
Mrs. Romanato.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Fagascatos.
Mr. Fagascatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Ms. Zarovitz.
Ms. Zerowitz.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Monsieur Yakino.
Mr. Yakino.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Dogood.
Mr. Dogood.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Ms. Vandenveld.
Ms. Vandenveld.
Monsieur Serré. Correction. Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Monsieur Robillard.
Monsieur Robillard.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Ms. Sidhu Brampton South.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zayed.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Ali.
Mr. Ali.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Hanley.
Mr. Hanley.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Meow.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Ms. Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
Ms. McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Ms. Idlout.
Miss Idlout.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Ms. Dance.
Miss Dance.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Ms. Blaney.
Miss Blaney.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Monsieur Boularis.
Monsieur Boudris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Ms. Barron.
Miss Barron.
Monsieur Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. Zarillo.
Miss Arillo.
Ms. Kwan.
Miss Kwan.
Ms. May Saanich Gulf Islands.
Miss May Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Michaud.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Thériault.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Saint-Clair Desgagnés.
Madame Saint-Clair Desgagnés.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Miss Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Ms. Dancho.
Miss Dancho.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abu Tayyif.
Mr. Abu Tayyif.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Aitchison.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Morantz.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr.